On today's Locked On Bucks, we react to the news that Darvin Ham reportedly returning to Milwaukee as the top assistant on Doc Rivers' staff, what that means for the coaching staff, and some other names that we've heard, and some thoughts on what is not a pretty NBA Finals for Bucks fans. We dig into that coming up after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Bucks. I am Justin Garcia, joined by Camille Davis and Frank Madden, as we thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day. Free and available wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find us on YouTube as well. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. $150 with any winning $5 bet. Just head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. We mentioned the big news at the top, so that is the place to start. Earlier in the afternoon on Tuesday, or Monday, days are already blurring together here, but early in the afternoon, we saw the tweet come out from Adrian Wojnarowski that Darvin Ham set to rejoin the Bucks as the lead assistant on Doc Rivers' staff. So there's a lot of questions and branches to that tree that we'll get to, but we'll start with this, Camille. I suppose maybe we probably owe an apology to a lot of the listeners because that name came up quite a bit. And I know I was pretty strong with this. I think we both said, look, I'd like it too. It's not going to happen, though. But Darvin Ham was just fired by the Lakers. You don't go from head coach to assistant coach months later. So that was the biggest thing that shocked me, that I was surprised that Darvin Ham, number one, turned down Mike Budenholzer to do the same thing in Phoenix. And then a couple of weeks later does that with the Bucks. You just don't typically see that. You're better served to just say, look, I'm getting paid by the Lakers. I'll take the year off. Maybe I do TV. Maybe I do consulting work. And then I'm in on that next coaching carousel the next summer.
The Mike Budenholzer piece was the part of it that really threw me for a loop, because when I saw that Darvin Ham turned down an assistant role with Mike Budenholzer stuff, I was like, okay, maybe, Darvin's going to take the year off. Like you mentioned, he just was a head coach. Maybe he's not looking to jump back into coaching as an assistant so quickly. And then boom, next thing you know, Woj is talking about, no, he's coming to Milwaukee as the lead assistant under Doc Rivers. And I just was like, wow, like it's not Phoenix that he takes, but he comes back to Milwaukee without that Mike Budenholzer connection, but yet and still we know he has a connection to some of the guys still in this locker room. And Darvin Ham coming back is a big get for this Milwaukee Bucks team. Like that's a great lead assistant to have on your team. And I know there were some people who thought that the Bucks hiring of Adrian Griffin was an overcorrection of missing a Darvin Ham type of presence in the locker room, just that type of personality. So to get Darvin Ham back on this bench, it's one of the most senior coaching benches that I've seen in the league in a while now. So with Darvin Ham, now you have another prior head coach on your bench. So like the experience is there, but then the question becomes what to make of all of the Sam Cassell news that we were hearing prior to that. And Frank, I know I saw you tweet about it earlier, but saying like you think that the ship on Sam Cassell has sailed at this point with the hire of Darvin Ham, and I'd be inclined to agree with you on that one.
Well, first off, Justin, as far as options, in a gap year, like if I had just been fired by an NBA team and getting paid, I think I was just looking. So Darvin had a 4-year contract. He's getting paid at $3 to $5 million. I'm seeing. Yeah. You could do the things that you suggested, or you could do what I would do, which is absolutely nothing. I would just hang out, collect my paycheck, but then again, that's why I'm not, an assistant coach for in the NBA or a head coach in the NBA, right? You don't exactly get those jobs by.
We'll see. Because
yeah, that's right.
Podcasters got it.
That's true. If my fellow podcaster JJ Redick gets the Lakers job, then I'm gonna have to start putting my name in. If he can get it, why not me? But Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting. I hadn't really thought about it, him coming back. Obviously, the fact that he had the connection to Bud and not Doc, obviously, like didn't make it kind of immediately jump off the page. But, we've seen it like, again, like depending on the guy, like, especially these guys who are not super established as head coaches, like someone like a Bud who's been a head coach for, basically a decade, and had, had whatever he was making, 8 million, 7 million, whatever he was making. He certainly could afford to kind of hang back a year and kind of figure out what he wanted to do. With Darvin, obviously he's only coached a couple years. He's obviously going to make a fair bit of money these next couple years as he sees out the end of that the Lakers contract that he never got to finish. But yeah, I think it's interesting that he's coming back. And my logic, Camille, on the Sam Cassell piece was, a couple things, right? I think we heard one that the Bucks were trying to tempt Sam Cassell by making him the highest paid assistant coach
Mm-hmm.
in the sport. So we just heard explicitly that Darvin was coming back to be the lead assistant. So presumably Sam Cassell would be coming back to not be the lead assistant, which would be weird then if you're offering him 2.5 million or whatever was being suggested to be the highest paid assistant, but not be the lead assistant. Who knows what Darvin's getting paid, because again, he's got this kind of big contract that he's kind of still making with the Lakers. And then the other piece too is, I mean, if you're Sam, he's not the lead assistant with the Celtics currently, because old friend Charles Lee is the lead assistant in Boston, but Charles Lee is going to Charlotte to head coach the Hornets next year. So presumably Sam has an inside line if he doesn't get, for instance, the Lakers head coaching job. Again, all this stuff, it's just musical chairs. If he doesn't get like the Lakers job, or I don't know if there's any other jobs that he would potentially have an angle on, I assume he could go back and just be the lead assistant for the Celtics. Pretty good gig. And that would seem to be, a better career move, presumably, than being, on the bench in Milwaukee where you're not the lead assistant because you just hired Darvin. So again, that's my assumption here, that like presumably it maybe doesn't make sense for either side at this stage. And again, the pursuit of Sam, maybe, again, was that all happen concurrent to some of these Darvin conversations? I would guess so, just given some of the timing, all this. But I think either way, it's a really good get for the Bucks. Again, bridging kind of the success of yesteryear, unknown quantity, personality wise with Giannis and Chris, Brooke, etc., and gives you some continuity. And again, I think, I don't know, not to put on like the conspiracy hat or something like that, but I think one of the problems for the Bucks last year was when they made the decision to move on from Adrian Griffin, Terry Stotts or another facsimile, another kind of proven NBA former head coach was not on the sideline anymore. There wasn't that option. You felt like you had to go outside of the building in order to bring in Doc Rivers, which is unusual, right? That's not usually what happens in the middle of the season. We've seen it, a number of times. Happened with Chris Finch, happened with Quinn Snyder in Atlanta. But that's not typical. And we saw last year, it's really hard. We don't have any context history with the team. So again, not to say that like Doc Rivers needs to look over his shoulder at Darvin Ham next year. But, look, Doc signed between now and 26, 27. That's a long time. Doc is, old by coaching standards. I would expect that he will want to see out that contract of $10 million a year, given the financial incentives involved. But certainly if there is another negative outcome, let's just say from a coaching perspective, I think with Darvin around, you're less likely to have that scenario because you have a more stable bench with, say, stronger relationships with your core guys. But B, in the event that something like that does happen, you do have a more obvious kind of backup option now with Darvin Ham on the bench. But again, I'm sure the Bucks are not hoping to have to pull that lever, but certainly it's at least an option.
It is at this point a very loaded bench that you have, and it's a stark contrast to what it was a year ago, especially a week prior to training camp when Terry Stotts left. And it was one of the larger conversations we had earlier in the year last year was, man, when you looked at the bench under Bud, you had some established guys and guys that went on to become head coaches. So you knew it was a strong bench. And, not to say it wasn't a strong bench, but it was a very inexperienced bench. That is not going to be the case this year. I do want to get a little bit more into the Sam Cassell piece, and if we hypothesize what this could mean as it pertains to the Lakers and that pursuit, but also why Darvin Ham would choose to come back to Milwaukee. Is there are a couple of names that basically did what Darvin Ham is doing. So we'll share that and get into that conversation coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. It is winner take all time in the NBA and NHL playoffs, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOnNBA and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So I guess we'll start with the Sam Cassell piece. Frank, the point that you mentioned, I think, is one of two scenarios. The fact that he is not the lead assistant with the Boston Celtics. Charles Lee is leaving. Boston's in a pretty good spot when you look at the age of their guys. Granted, they're going to be in the second apron, but they appear to be on their way to that illustrious banner number 18 and have a lot of that group coming back next season. So that would be a spot that, yeah, I'd like to stick around here as the lead assistant. But if we want to get into reckless speculation, we've seen his name linked to the Lakers. I don't know about you guys. It seems like JJ Redick is going to be the coach of the Lakers, and I'm not fully sure what to make of the Dan Hurley situation. It seems like partial truth, partially somebody doing their friend a favor as well. So I'm assuming JJ Redick is going to be the head coach of the Lakers. We saw Sam Cassell's name there as one of the candidates. But you can't overlook the fact that he is represented by Clutch Sports and that JJ Redick has not coached before, that I can't help but wonder if Sam Cassell is going to end up as the lead assistant with the Lakers under JJ Redick.
That would be interesting. I do want to say this real quick, Frank, before you jump into, if JJ Redick does become the head coach of the Lakers, do we go back to saying that Shams was right initially after all of this that came out?
Vindication for Shams. Yeah, it is funny. I was actually texting with our friend Eric Name about this the other day, because when Woj first started breaking the news around this, it was almost like he was right again when the first idea of well, Danny Hurley was always the number one option and all this.
Mm-hmm.
And the way he was framing it, it was like, I get it. Like, you're going to come off looking like the guy that had the real scoop, a day after Shams or whatever was saying that they were zeroing in on JJ Redick. But part of me was also like, well, wait a minute. Like, Woj, you /Shams / everybody else, like, apparently you either didn't know that
you didn't go with this from the start,
or you were sitting on it. I don't know which one is better. But like, hold off on like spiking the football about you getting the scoop, because it raises questions about him as well. And I think, as you were alluding to, and I think Joe Pompliano, who is a good like sports business follow on Twitter, I retweeted his comment, which was, kind of just, let's just say, pointing out with some sarcasm, the fact that, isn't it interesting that Danny Hurley, leaks this news. It comes out through Woj, who wrote a book about Danny Hurley's dad.
Yep.
And now, Danny Hurley's, I don't know if he's actually going to get a new contract. I know he just got a new one last year, but certainly everybody in Connecticut is now just like feeling so thankful that Danny Hurley is willing to stay. And, I'm sure this will be leveraged at some point to get him yet another, new contract that will increase his salary even further. Because again, he just turned down 6 years, $70 million. Yeah. And last year he signed a 6-year, $30 million contract, whatever it was. So yeah, I mean, definitely some interesting newsbreaker leaking, back scratching, whatever kind of conspiracy theorizing we could do. And for sure, I'm sure Shams is rooting for JJ Redick to get this job, so that in a kind of long game perspective, he ends up turning out quote unquote right. Although at this point, who knows? I will say this though, I I am rooting for JJ Redick to get this job, not because I think he would do the best job. I don't have nothing against JJ really, but I just would find it like have the highest potential for kind of catastrophe, disaster slash whatever. Just because again, JJ being that kind of high profile, kind of pretty boy former player with no experience, like the history of kind of that archetype, the former player with no coaching experience, not
We
great.
saw it work out well for Steve Nash, who was a much more likable guy than JJ Redick.
I thought you were going to say Steve Kerr, who had 5 year, who had a spell in the front office, and then he was a broadcaster. So it was a little bit different. Larry Bird also was in, I think, the Celtics front office and sort
He
of
could be the next
roles.
Pat Riley for all we know.
There you go. I don't know, but yeah, certainly of late. I mean, hey, we saw in Milwaukee the lifelong assistant grinder, maybe also not the best archetype for a head coaching hire. So I don't know what to make of that, but yeah, I don't know. Good luck to JJ or whoever gets that job, because that just seems like, I don't know, like the Batman GIF where he's the old Batman TV show where he's running around with the bomb, trying to figure out what to do with it. I feel like that's the Lakers' job. It just seems like you're kind of set up to fail. And unless you really get like that, $70 million contract type thing where they're kind of stuck with you, it just seems like the kind of thing where you're hired to kind of get recycled, as Darvin Ham found out.
Well, as we may find out in Detroit, and we found out in Milwaukee, you're not stuck with anybody. So the coach is stuck with the money. That's the big thing.
Yeah, the full money in this case. Yeah.
The other thing that to wrap up the Darvin Ham news, and look, we mentioned, hey, Darvin Ham is here, but as you both pointed out, look, this is a big deal when you think about the staff of, again, where it was a year ago as the season was starting, as we learned that Terry Stotts was leaving. And one of the questions that we all asked each other was, well, who's the lead assistant on this staff now? Is it Joe Prunty? Is it Patrick Mutombo? And I never came up with an answer. The Bucks never gave one either of, well, they all kind of pitch in and they all handle the scouts. So there is no lead assistant. And it's, when you don't have a lead assistant, it's kind of like the old, you got two quarterbacks, you don't really have a quarterback. So you're not dealing with that now. I mentioned this before, and as soon as I put it out there, I thought, yeah, you know what? I bet this happened more recently than I thought. And Frank, as you pointed out, it did 2 years ago. But when was the last time a non-first year head coach had two former head coaches on his staff? It was the Warriors, who had Mike Brown and Kenny Atkinson for that 1 year before Mike Brown left to become the coach of the Kings. Those are the only comps to this for Darvin Ham that I can think of. Kenny Atkinson, after getting fired by the Nets, directly went to becoming an assistant with the Clippers and then ultimately Golden State. And the other guy that was in the discussions for the Lakers job, James Borrego, after getting fired by the Hornets, became an assistant with the Pelicans in that same offseason. And that's what Darvin Ham is doing. You look at the bench now where Darvin Ham is your number one assistant. You still have Dave Yeager on the bench. You still have Rex Kalamian. You added Pete Dominguez last season. We mentioned Patrick Mutombo. We mentioned Joe Prunty. It's a loaded bench all of a sudden that you have. My question is, and I don't mean this as a bad thing, why would Darvin Ham do this? And to me, I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts. As I mentioned, we did see it recently with a couple of coaches, but I just go back to him turning down Bud, which we all kind of speculated if he does become an assistant, it's probably going to be with Bud. I go back to each of the two times Darvin Ham came to Milwaukee as the head coach of the Lakers, and especially this last time, he spoke at length about how special Milwaukee is to him, like a second home, essentially, going back to his days as a player and those years as a coach, winning a championship here. He still has a very strong relationship with a number of players on the team. I think the biggest ones you would point to, probably Giannis, Bobby Portis, Chris Middleton as well. And he has family in the area too. So I think those are the big things, which we may have undersold when kind of dismissing it, that kind of led Darvin Ham back here versus taking that job in Phoenix with Mike Budenholzer.
Yeah, I think those are really key reasons about it. Thinking about the connection to the city, which I guess, like you mentioned, we kind of underestimated at times. As mentioned before as well, his son played for UWM. Like the connections that he has to the city are pretty deep. But I also think there's something to what Frank was saying in case things don't work out here, this could be a spot where if a situation had to be made with an in-season change, he could be somebody who was first in line for that, or necessarily, I mean, think about the actual uh, situation of coming to Milwaukee. You get to play with some or coach some guys that you are familiar with. You have a great relationship, so that trust is already established. I know it's been mentioned before that Darvin Ham is a voice that the Bucks locker room respected, and he was somebody who could have those tough conversations with guys about being accountable in their role. Are you doing what you're supposed to do? And they listen to Darvin Ham about that, so he has that level of respect in the locker room, and that can't be undersold. But also, he probably looked around the landscape as well. And this is not me poking fun at Phoenix, the situation that's going on there, but they still need a point guard. And there has been some off-season rumblings about the possibility of Bronny James going to Phoenix and what all that might entail as well if that does come to pass. A little less drama in Milwaukee than what is going around that Phoenix team at the moment as well. So, I mean, that could be part of it. But like I said initially, I was surprised to see that he did not follow Bud and instead came back here. But the connections he has to the players, to the city, an opportunity as well could be good. And if the Bucks bounce back the way that we think they can with an offseason with Dame and Giannis getting things together, and he can be a part of that, that can also accelerate him getting another head coaching gig elsewhere if this upcoming season goes well in Milwaukee as well.
I mean, it's certainly a comfortable place, probably. I mean, that's probably the number one thing, right? It's a comfortable spot. Doc is not in danger of losing his job this year, barring, again, famous last words, some unexpected turn of events. Again, that said, obviously there is a lot of pressure in Milwaukee, but as you said, Camille, like Phoenix, man, even though Bud isn't, I don't see Bud getting fired this year either, but like, man, that's just a, let's just say, a more combustible potential place in Phoenix. And I think I am curious from a Bucks perspective. I mean, the news that trickled out about what they were, potentially willing to pay Sam Cassell to come as lead assistant. Um, Again, I don't know, with like offsets and things like that, I don't know how much that would even be a factor for Darvin. But how motivated were they to bring Darvin in? What else, kind of what other assurances may have been made? Tough to say. I mean, the main thing I think is being the lead guy, which obviously he was previously under Bud as well. And I think certainly to the extent that Giannis and, well, mainly Giannis, but also Chris, Brooke, at all, to the extent that they voice support for bringing Darvin back. And I could certainly imagine them talking to Darvin, texting, calling, whatever, and telling him, hey man, come back. Right. I mean, we obviously saw, a couple years ago when Darvin was taking over the reins for Bud head coaching. I think it was in Charlotte, correct? Correct me if I'm wrong. He got his first win as a head coach. The famous Darvin Running Man. I think that was the night he did the Running Man kind of shuffle, drenched in beers. You could see how the players celebrated him. Kind of how they felt about him. And you also saw it, I think, when the Bucks played the Lakers these last couple of years, and just the kind of way that Giannis and company talked about Darvin pregame, postgame. Took, I think, maybe at least for me, took a little bit of the edge off a couple of really annoying losses last year, knowing that, hey, at least Darvin Ham was the guy on the other end of it, and obviously he was going through a challenging year last year, which ultimately saw him fired. So yeah, probably just in terms of like comfort level, I would say that's probably the number one thing, especially knowing the front office here. And then the only other thing, it's weird, I only see this in one place, but Real GM, not the message board, but just like the official page for Darvin's son Donovan Ham, listed him as being hired as a player development guy for the Bucks last year. I have seen, I was just searching around. I can't find any other evidence that he's currently a player development guy with the Bucks. Justin, I don't know if you've heard anything about this,
Yeah,
but
I
like
hadn't.
obviously, like as we were discussing, like if he was in the area, or heck, if he was employed by the Bucks, certainly that would play a role in anybody's willingness to come back, right? So again, I think that's probably kind of a to be confirmed type of thing.
Yeah.
But again, family is always part of it. Darvin, his family, to the extent that they were comfortable coming back to Milwaukee, having just been here a couple of years ago. Again, I'm going to go ahead and say that leaving LA probably was not something that they were too unwilling to do, especially given just the bright lights and cost of living, man. Cost of living matters.
Right.
When you get old, you appreciate a place where it's not ridiculous to own a nice house. So Darvin, let's be honest, Darvin. It's not
Are
like
you
we
speaking from experience?
Speaking from experience. Hey, I moved from Boston to Texas. And Darvin. I mean, let's think about it realistically, right? I mean, obviously, it was a big deal for him to get this Laker job. We can talk about was that really the best place for him to get a head coaching job? It's a head coaching job.
Yeah,
Right.
More money than
there's 30 of
obviously.
them.
Yeah, and he got obviously serious money to go be the head coach. Not that he was not making any money as an assistant for the last decade under Bud. But it's not like he was a star player, right? And that was a long time ago that he was an NBA player. So so that stuff matters, I mean, that's like your livelihood. And again, not to act like getting paid $1 million a year as an assistant or something is not much, but I'd say certainly again had a level of comfort here, and hopefully it works out, obviously. But I think from a stability standpoint, to me, that's the main thing.
Yeah, I mean, the stability point, how loaded your bench is, as we've talked about quite a bit now. And the thing
The
that we all
coaches,
touched on,
not the players.
To be clear.
TBD on that. Yeah, and then what we all touched on, and Camille, you mentioned it a couple of times too, but hearing Bobby Portis, especially early into that first season without Darvin Ham, where he specifically said, we miss Darvin Ham. And towards the end of the year as well, a number of players talking about that's the guy that we miss, that he was the guy, as you pointed to, would have the tough conversations with us. We leaned on him as a former player. That was something that, Bud didn't have. So getting that back, that year number 2 with Doc Rivers, or year 1.5, the first full season with him, the first off season with Damian Lillard, big pieces for this team, but how they round out the rest of the roster is certainly the biggest part of it, and how they can play to the level of a team that appears to be on the cusp of winning an NBA championship. We'll share some of our thoughts on the NBA Finals. One very popular discourse that is taking place right now as it pertains to the Bucks point guard and a player that may be the Finals MVP. Holy cow. We'll get into that after this on Locked On Bucks. This next segment of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by BetterHelp. And look, sometimes we all have things that we want to get off our chest. Maybe it's something along the lines of what we hinted at. Maybe you're one of those that said, look, the Bucks should have never traded Jrue Holiday. He could have come through in the clutch for this team. It was a bad trade, and now we're seeing it play out for the Boston Celtics. Maybe it's something more serious than your favorite team or favorite player and their value to that team. And that's where BetterHelp comes in with the ultimate assist, as we can all carry around different stressors, big or small. And when we keep them bottled up, it can start to affect us negatively. Therapy is a safe space to get things off your chest and to figure out how to work through whatever is weighing you down. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It is entirely online, designed to be convenient and flexible, and most importantly, it is suited directly to your schedule. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire, and from there, you'll get matched with a licensed therapist. You can even switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA and get 10% off your first month today. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. All right, guys. The Boston Celtics are 2 wins away from their 18th NBA championship. And there's been 2 very interesting conversations taking place with the Celtics. One of them is around the superstar that wasn't and who is actually the best player on the team. But now we've started to hear more and more of the why did the Bucks trade Jrue Holiday? Bucks fans said this about Jrue Holiday. It's incorrect. I'll say this. I think there was a lot of pushback that probably went a little too far, whether it be among Bucks fans or whoever, saying, you can't count on Jrue Holiday in the playoffs. It's not a fair apples to apples comparison when you look at what Jrue Holiday was tasked with doing offensively for the Bucks and the role that he's been able to assume with the Boston Celtics. The tough part is, I think we all kind of said, well, if Boston wins, hey, at least Jrue gets championship number 2. But as you're seeing it come closer and closer to realization, I got to tell you, I don't feel that way at all. I mean, to be clear, I'm happy for Jrue, but this isn't at least Jrue got a championship.
It's different seeing it in person, huh?
It's just the team, Camille, and the constant, hey, number 18 and Jason Tatum. It's enough.
No, I definitely understand that. What you said about the comparison of it not being apples to apples, I think that's the really important part. What he's being asked to do in Boston is not the same workload that was being asked of him here in Milwaukee. And going back to that point again is why the Damian Lillard trade makes sense. Of course, when you're seeing Jrue Holiday playing excellent, the defense is still as amazing as you remember it being. You're seeing him hitting key buckets down the stretch. You're seeing him be efficient from the field throughout the finals as well. It's one of those things where you're like, man, wish we kind of had that back here. But again, I understand the process as to why the Bucks made the trade that they did. You look at past postseasons, the problem with the Bucks tended to be that half-court offense. It would stall. So the logic, of course, is like, let's add some more offense to this team so that when the game slows down in the playoffs, we have another person who can get to their shot outside of Giannis, outside of Chris. Like, let's try to make this offense a bit more dynamic in the crunch. Unfortunately for the Bucks this postseason run, there was no Giannis, and then Dame was banged up, so you didn't even get to see the full potential of what that lineup might be like. And of course, we've talked at length about how the Doc Rivers era had started for him here in Milwaukee with the Bucks and the record, and were we seeing progress? Were we not seeing progress? But oh, look at the schedule. Like, there were so many different factors that played into it where this first season of Dame in Milwaukee, I can see why some people would be underwhelmed. But it's like I've been saying, like, next season is the one that's really going to paint the full picture for me with this particular pairing. So again, I get it too. Seeing Jrue do his thing, it's bittersweet. I'm somebody who picked the Celtics to win this, I think in 7, which it might not even take that long for this series to come to a close. But like you said, at least Jrue will get another ring. But the other side to that is thinking, like, he is signed with them for a few more years. So this is not going to be the last we see of this iteration of the Boston Celtics, which might pose some problems for the Bucks.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of one of these things, right? I mean, especially like if you're reading this through the Twitter lens, right? It just becomes kind of the zero sum of Bucks win, Celtics win. If Celtics win, Bucks must have made a mistake, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, fundamentally, I mean, that ignores the fact that like this wasn't even a direct kind of 1-for-1 transaction, right? It ended up working out that way. You know, like if you distill it down to like Bucks versus Celtics. But I think honestly, I think the you guys kind of had hit on it. I mean, we saw, literally like with Jrue, the last thing we saw from Jrue was another, severe struggles in the playoffs with, especially with Giannis out, him having to be the primary ball handler and kind of the, 2A, 2B type option alongside Chris. Again, like it was just not something that he was able, a load that he was able to carry offensively, and very different from what he's being asked to do now. And so, I mean, we've seen this movie before. So the idea that like you're just going to run it back and, that like all would have been solved. Again, like, was there flukiness in the Heat loss? Yeah, sure. Right. But there's even more flukiness in the Pacers loss, considering, you didn't even see any of Giannis in that series.
Right.
and Dame missed a couple games as well. So, it sucks, for the Bucks, obviously, that things didn't work out with Dame yet. But I think, Jrue ending up in Boston by way of Portland, and fitting in seamlessly in a reduced role there, again, I think just speaks more to just the fact that, the Celtics just had a great offseason between Porzingis and Holiday, and have just a really great roster constructed to go out and win. I mean, the Celtics should be favorites even if they had Brogdon and Rob Williams still, right? Even if Robert Williams was out for the year, right? If Brogdon was healthy, do I think suddenly the Celtics are not the title favorites? No. I mean, Brogdon had statistically a better year last year than Jrue had this year, probably. And Brogdon's not the type of defender Jrue is, obviously, but again, that was a stacked team, and kudos to Brad Stevens and company. They were able to optimize that roster even further over the summer, and it's worked out. And now they're to quote LeBron James in a tweet that worked out totally fine, 2 down, 2 to go. So what could go wrong? But I think the Bucks piece, I think if you are, I think my view has been they had to make a change, and you laid it out, Camille, right? Offense has always been the thing that hurt them whenever they got knocked out of the playoffs. Really, during the Bud era, always came down to offense stagnating. The defense generally held up its end of the bargain. You can say maybe not against the Heat, but really it was the offense that stagnated and blew those last 2 games more so than the defense in that Miami series last year. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a dice roll you do it every time. And guys, does Giannis sign the extension if they don't make the trade for Damian Lillard? I don't know, but that's not I don't want to take a do-over on that. I think getting Jrue, I think getting Dame absolutely played a role in Giannis being willing to sign for that extension last year, in which case, all of this conversation is null and void and doesn't really matter in the first place, right? So again, if the Bucks don't win a championship with Dame, of course, there's going to be disappointment there. Doesn't mean that, now it was the wrong move. I don't think so. I think it was
not yet.
I think it was a sound move, and you just have to hope that health is better next year, stability, coaching is better next year. And I think if you're going to nitpick one aspect about that move from the Bucks perspective, I think a really key thing that we heard in kind of all the blow by blow reporting that came down after it was that John Horst insisted that Jrue's name basically not get out, right? That basically the Blazers were not allowed to shop Jrue as part of a single package through, kind of multi-team package, that they had to be willing to accept Jrue, have the trade go through, and then go out and market him to the rest of the league, which obviously they were not that worried about, taking on that risk. They ultimately did it. But if the Bucks say, you know what, we'll play with fire and we'll let Jrue's name get out there, that he's available, because we think that we're going to get the deal done, then there's obviously a much higher likelihood of Jrue being routed to a team other than the
Clippers
Celtics.
or
right. Because there were certainly, or the Warriors, right? There were teams that would make sense, ideally out west. And in that scenario, obviously the Bucks still end up with Dame, and you end up with Jrue not playing for the Boston Celtics. That would have been your ideal outcome, I think, not trading Jrue Holiday. The risk with doing that was if that deal falls apart, then Jrue goes into the season knowing that you were looking to trade him for, again, not that being willing to trade him for Damian Lillard is some
big insult.
Insult. But Jrue obviously was shell shocked when that trade was announced, and I think that's probably the hardest part about this is that I think he does feel like, man, you guys kind of kicked me to the curb.
He wanted to be in Milwaukee.
Yeah. And so I think that's the hardest part. I think for me, I will be happy. I'm not rooting for Jrue or any Celtic in the moment. I think if and when they win a championship, I will be happy for Jrue because he's a great person and a great teammate, and can't wish negative things upon him per se. But it does kind of suck that I think it's going to take a little bit. At some point, down the road, Drew's going to be honored when they do, 10-year anniversary, 20-year anniversary of the championship team. And I certainly hope he comes back and, like is part of that, but it absolutely adds an awkward kind of layer
Feel
to
to
all
it.
of this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the tough part, that you can understand why that was the play by John Horst. And I said this too at the time. I mean, I think you had to assume there's a pretty, maybe not a full blown assumption, but a pretty good chance he's going to the Celtics. He's going to get rerouted there. So again, it's the jury is still out. I still think, to the points that you guys have both made, there's no way of telling this, and I don't think it's coping. I don't think the season goes much differently for the Bucks if they don't make that trade. Even if everything lined up where you're playing the Pacers in the first round, and you don't have Giannis, your offense isn't going to be good enough. Your defense is going to be better. Your defense will be better throughout the regular season, but you're still going to run into those offensive issues. I mean, he really is in the best possible spot with the way he's used and the collection of players around him. I do wonder, and there's no way of ever knowing this unless John Horst gives this exclusive to Eric Name or somebody else and really opens up about the trade. I do wonder if they thought, hey, we know he could go to Boston, but we really think, because of the LA connection, the fact that they need a point guard, we think the Clippers are going to get this done, and he's going to go to the Clippers. And if that's kind of what eased them into making that deal as well, or at least feeling like, all right, this could bite us, but we don't think it will. The big thing to me that we'll all end up looking back on is just the package that the Blazers got for Jrue Holiday, who, at this moment, it's either he or Jaylen Brown that's going to win the finals MVP as things currently stand. But that trade, Malcolm Brogdon, who they did not trade this season for some reason.
Weird.
Robert Williams, who, it depends on what camp you're in. Maybe you can talk yourself into the upside. Otherwise, you're saying, look, there's a pretty glaring red flag here, and that is the health of Robert Williams, which, oh, by the way, became an issue again this season. They have the 14th overall pick in this year's draft that the Celtics sent from the Golden State Warriors, and then a 2029 unprotected first-round pick. But look, as we've seen the Bucks deal with those, if it gets you a championship, so be it. That's all the Celtics had to give up to bring in Jrue Holiday. That it really points back to, man, Portland, you really couldn't get any more than this for Jrue Holiday?
Maybe not. I mean, or they could have, and they just didn't want to trade him into the same conference that they were going to be playing in as well. Because initially I thought that Clippers move made some sense. I was like, oh, Clippers can make sense for Jrue Holiday. We mentioned the Warriors as a team that makes sense as well. So Portland could have been playing a game as well of, we don't want to keep him in our conference, although they are a few years away from any real contention. So, that doesn't necessarily make too much sense, but that could be part of the theory. I do know that there are some teams that operate in that way, just on general principle. So that could have been what it is for them. But yeah, if Robert Williams doesn't come back healthy, or at least provide them a good trade chip, that return will be looked at as something very questionable if it leads to Boston getting Jrue Holiday, a missing piece to help them get that 18th banner.
I would say, I don't know that there was an order of magnitudes better deal out there. I think, again, some of this is on them for whatever reason, not moving Brogdon. Again, imagine some of that is because there probably wasn't a robust market for Brogdon. And we saw last summer, the Celtics tried to trade him to LA, which
Clippers,
another interesting kind of sliding doors moment is like, what if the Clippers don't back out of that deal? I think Porzingis still ends up in Boston. But then you have Marcus Smart. And then, I guess Marcus Smart could have been traded easily instead of Brogdon to Portland or something like that. But yeah, lots of different things could have happened. And, I think part of this is, it's one thing if the Bucks had to play the Celtics and Jrue killed them, then I think it'd be much easier to say well, talk about your all-time backfires. But as you said, Justin, really didn't. I don't think it materially changed the Bucks kind of outcome, because I don't think Jrue meaningfully changes. Certainly not in a positive way, unless you're just saying because he would have been healthy against the Pacers or something like that. But I don't think it really kind of mattered to the Bucks in the sense that they didn't get far enough to play the Celtics, so it didn't really kind of come into play. But I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. I think Golden State would have been a great landing spot. Like, was there kind of a Kuminga, Andrew Wiggins, Moses Moody type package back when before Andrew Wiggins had that disastrous season last year? The Clippers, obviously, not like they had a lot of draft picks, but I don't know. What are they offering? Like Terrence Mann and
I mean, that's the thing. Yeah, they don't have the draft capital. They don't have much in terms of young players. So,
yeah. So it's again, I think it's interesting. I mean, the other team I was worried about was Miami. And if he ends up in Miami, that would have been probably the other, kind of like, oh crap, destination that we could have seen Jrue end up in. And we kind of forget about it now because obviously the Heat kind of stuttered and kind of disappeared quickly in the playoffs, but obviously we're dealing with their own injuries. But that certainly would have been, in some respects, maybe even more awkward given the more recent history with the Heat. But as things turned out, obviously you at this point would say like, well, yeah, I guess I would have rather had Jrue end up in Miami rather than further strengthening Boston. But look, it's not like he signed as a free agent or something with the Celtics. Like they had to give up some stuff. Again, like we can say, obviously it was not a great deal for Portland, but I would still say that the Celtics would probably be in the same spot more or less now that they're in, even if they hadn't made that trade. But I'd say they're certainly also better for it. And I mean, now we'll see, right? I mean, I think the other piece is too, Jrue and Dame are pretty much the exact same age, 33 going on 34. Jrue has already gotten his long-term extension. Dame, is already on his kind of long-term deal for more money than Jrue. And we'll see how both those guys age, right? But the nice part for Jrue is like, he can pretty much be the 4th, 5th best player on the Celtics, and nobody's really going to be calling into sports talk radio and making a big deal out of it, right? And if
at least in year one, yeah.
Well, as long as they're winning, right? Like then nobody's going to care. But Jalen, Jason, Porzingis, and Derek White, who, I mean, does this mean if Jrue got what he got, like is Derek White now a max player? Like I'm fascinated to see what he ends up getting when his contract's up after next year. But I mean, again, I hate the Celtics as much as anyone. I lived for 15 years in Boston, but also there's also, I think like if you're, an opposing fan, it's also just like, well, whatever. None of us live in that city. I choose not to interact with, Celtics fans on Twitter, so I don't get my mentions blown up. So I recommend to everyone else for your own sanity. Like if you're bothered by another team doing well, just don't engage. You don't have to engage with people from the fan of the team you don't like. It's working for my sanity, guys. I don't know. As a Celtics hater, I'm doing okay.
And that's the tough part. Why we mention the Celtics so much is, I mean, that's going to be the measuring stick for the Bucks and any team in the Eastern Conference next season again, because it's not, Frank, as you mentioned, not until the year after. So one summer from now that you start to face the extension questions for Porzingis and for Derek White. Jaylen Brown will be in year 2 of that massive extension at that point. And then Jason Tatum, the same conversation for him, which I would imagine he'll be pushing $60 million annually at that point. So it's 2 years from now that Celtics roster is incredibly expensive, and they're starting to face some of those same things that the Bucks are starting to face now with that second apron discussion. But the last thing to point out about Jrue as we wrap up here is he is now one of 4 players to have scored 25 points in a finals game for 2 separate franchises, despite not having been an all-star that season. And there are 2 Bucks on the list. Jrue Holiday doing it with the Bucks in 2021 and this year with the Celtics, and Bobby Dandridge doing it in the 71 finals with the Bucks and then with the Bullets in 78. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the piece we've all kind of accepted. Not to say it's impossible. The Bucks came back from an 0-2 hole in the finals, but the optics of that series versus this series, very, very different. It does seem as though the Celtics are headed towards that championship. So at this point, we can accept that and say, look, fine. I hope Jrue Holiday gets the Finals
Yeah.
MVP then, where he can get that and his second title, and that's how we will accept this. Again, to put a bow on today, Darvin Ham back in Milwaukee as an assistant coach with the Bucks. So curious to see once we start to see some more news on that, and what this finalized coaching staff is going to look like. Some names we've already seen shed from that bench, but I think the big ones that people are focused in on now, Joe Prunty too. When you think about all the guys that have been added, what his future is like with the Bucks, because as Doc Rivers pointed out many times, it's a very, very big staff. And I know you've made subtractions, but adding Darvin Ham to it makes it a very big staff once more. We will be back once again tomorrow to share some more thoughts on the finals and see if there's any more news coming out of the Darvin Ham front. For Frank and Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.